At 9:23 hours on June 14, 2025, steel met nerve in the South China Sea, a naval poker game where the loser wouldn't fold chips but billion-dollar warships. USS Princeton's SPY-1 radar detected a distant surface contact roughly 200 kilometers out. At first, it appeared routine, a planned surface vessel moving along a standard lane. 90 seconds later, the profile changed. The Type 052D destroyer that had been cruising at 18 knots abruptly surged to 30. That kind of acceleration at sea isn't casual. Inside Princeton's Combat Information Center, background chatter faded as the ship's watch officer updated the tactical data link, and air defense stations verified weapon readiness states. The Chinese warship adjusting course was the intercept vector felt intentional, like a fighter drifting closer in a ring, gloves up, eyes locked. At 09:26 hours, classification confirmed what the operators already sensed. Type 052D Luoyang 3-class destroyer. Its YJ-18 anti-ship systems carried a strike envelope that could fold distance in minutes, turning blue water into a knife fight. On CIC screens, the geometry showed two armed platforms sliding toward each other on quiet, converging lines. Gunfighters pacing the same empty street, weapons still holstered but palms already warm. Princeton's own 122-cell VLS capacity sat dormant, a magazine full of live rounds waiting for a nod no one wanted to give, like an orchestra holding its breath just before the downbeat that changes a night forever. At 9:29 hours, the captain requested an intent estimate. Closure math projected weapons release range in 17 minutes. The doctrine called for readiness without provocation. The ship went to higher alert quietly, no sudden maneuvers, no transmissions that could be misconstrued. 17 minutes is a long time when one wrong move can start World War III. At 9:30 hours, the cooperative engagement capability automatically shared the developing track with every vessel in the strike group. The integrated tactical picture converged around the carrier. Nimitz, a 104,600-ton floating airfield and diplomatic instrument, adjusted flight operations in precise synchrony. Escort destroyers repositioned to construct overlapping defensive arcs. Merchant traffic in the corridor complicated defensive options. 46 commercial vessels were within 50 miles, each one a moving piece of shrapnel waiting to happen if shooting started. Among them was a Singapore flag container ship carrying high-value semiconductors and a South Korean LNG tanker worth hundreds of millions. Their presence was a high-stakes minefield in motion. Any hostile exchange here wouldn't just risk ships, but would punch holes straight through the arteries of global trade. At 9:35 hours, the big picture widened as airborne early warning assets reported departures from the Chinese carrier Shandong. An E-2D Hawkeye circling at 25,000 feet extended detection into the far reaches of the battlespace, and its sensors showed multiple J-15 fighters climbing and vectoring south. The signatures suggested reduced performance. The ski jump launch method forced compromises in fuel and weapons load, and the climb profiles reflected that penalty. American combat air patrols, conversely, were airborne with full fuel and live ordnance, tied together through a network that turned scattered sensors into a single, seamless view of the fight. The tactical advantage in the air was stacking against the Chinese as tracks, links, and fuel states were shared instantly among U.S. platforms. At 09:37 hours, aviation tempo increased. The carrier's deck erupted into the practiced choreography of power projection. Super Hornets launched in rapid succession, each catapult cycle delivering aircraft at precise intervals. Steam and smoke marked the rhythm. The flight deck functioned as a clockwork machine. Two sections of FA-18EF pushed into a combat air patrol CAP wall, one high at 35,000 feet, one mid at 25,000, spread in 20 nautical mile lateral offsets. Below them, a third element held at 15,000, covering the ingress lane. Overlapping missile envelopes formed a barrier. Nothing crossed without entering at least one shooter's range. EA-18G Growlers orbited on the flank, feeding jamming corridors into the fight, their ALQ-218 suites erasing pieces of the Chinese radar picture. A pair of E-2D Hawkeyes sat further back at 28,000 feet, stitching all tracks into a single coherent view across the strike group. Super Hornets in Buddy Store tanker config traced lazy arcs behind the wall, ready to keep fighters on station. Those jets climbed into assigned sectors, their radars painting inbound J-15 as they rose through altitude blocks. The Americans' active electronically scanned array radars could handle dozens of tracks simultaneously. The J-15S relied on mechanically swept sets and local sensor feeds. The disparity in situational awareness and weapons employment was stark. US pilots fought as a network, Chinese air crews as isolated nodes. That difference shaped every decision in the sky. At 9:43 hours, the electronic attack phase began. EA-18G Growlers slipped into jamming orbits and began pouring noise across hostile frequencies. On opposing screens, the picture fractured like throwing gravel into a smooth pond. The ripples distorted every reflection. False echoes multiplied. Genuine aircraft dissolved into static fog. Chinese situational awareness went from a clean grid to a haunted forest where real targets were now ghosts among shadows. Meanwhile, RC-135B Rivet joint aircraft circled at altitude, scooping up emissions like librarians, collecting scattered pages in a burning archive. Linguistics monitored and translated intercepted radio traffic. Chinese pilots requesting permission to escalate, but each step had to crawl up bureaucratic ladders while the electromagnetic storm kept rewriting the board beneath them. By the time approvals could descend, the tactical map had already shifted. At 9:47 hours, the Chinese destroyer escalated again. Its Type 346A shifted to a fire control quality track. The ship's illuminators spiked the carrier for about 30 seconds, in naval language, the equivalent of a finger sliding from the trigger guard onto the trigger. Across the American formation, the response was calm, cold, and immediate. Fire control solutions stayed ready but withheld, missiles aimed without launching, crews rigidly following rules of engagement that distinguished signal from spark. The message in the data was striking. China had shown intent. America had the reach, the readiness, and the discipline to turn a provocation into deterrence rather than destruction. At 9:51 hours, subsurface contact happened. Sonar operators aboard Princeton caught a low, resonant note in the undersea noise, a probable Type 039 diesel-electric submarine 15,000 yards and snorkeled. In acoustic terms, it was like a pickpocket clearing his throat in a silent room, an involuntary tell that marked his position. Princeton's sonar stitched the signature into the live battle picture, fusing undersea geometry with surface and air tracks until the theater resembled a three-dimensional chessboard with every piece exposed, every move lethal. If the shooting started, the submarine's timeline would shrink to seconds before an ASROC solution erased its square from the board. At 10:00 hours, air combat maneuvering commenced in earnest. U.S. fighters engaged in controlled engagements with J-15 sections, not to shoot down aircraft, but to test and demonstrate margins of capability. One Chinese jet made an aggressive close pass, attempting intimidation. An American pilot countered with a textbook 6 o'clock intercept, establishing a clear firing envelope in his helmet-mounted cueing system. Discipline held no weapons release, but the moment demonstrated who held the tactical upper hand. The sensor-to-shooter chain had worked, showing that dominance need not be expressed by ordnance. At 10:35 hours, attempts by Chinese elements to reform and regain altitude advantage faltered under continued electronic pressure. Any Chinese push entered overlapping U.S. weapons envelopes. The geometry left no safe corridor for a coordinated strike. At 11:00 hours, surface forces maintained station and adjusted positioning to maximize coverage. Princeton and nearby escorts shifted sectors, preserving overlapping missile arcs and tightening protective envelopes around merchant traffic. The maritime picture was kept deliberately transparent. Civilian ships were free to transit under the shield of U.S. operations while every hostile vector was catalogued and countered in real time. This synchronization of sensors and shooters meant the strike group could respond quickly while still observing rules intended to prevent unnecessary escalation. At 1200 hours, Additional Chinese surface units maneuvered to support their forward destroyer, attempting to close gaps or present alternative threats. Cooperative engagement capability across the U.S. formation immediately integrated those moves into the common tactical display and recalculated firing solutions. The U.S. cruisers and destroyers maintained weapons readiness at high levels. SM-6 and SM-2 launchers were on the grid for rapid shot quality updates. At 1400 hours, a deliberate demonstration was ordered. The carrier launched an extended air package. Fighters, electronic attack aircraft, and airborne early warning platforms, projecting a layered, visible umbrella of control. Growlers intensified jamming broadcasts, turning opposing radar arrays into sporadic mosaics of false positives. Super Hornets executed coordinated sweeps across expected avenues of approach, each sortie tied to the shipboard sensor grid and available shooters. The flight operations emphasized controlled escalation. Overwhelming capability presented clearly, with deconfliction maintained among friendly elements. At 1430 hours, the carrier intensified sortie rates and positioned aircraft to saturate the contested airspace. Early warning nodes maintained continuous tracks. Fighters rotated through patrol cycles to preserve endurance and maintain pressure on any adversary that lingered. The sorties served a dual role. They protected merchant transit corridors and signaled to the Chinese that any continuation of an aggressive posture would be met with multi-domain responses that layered effects across air, surface, and subsurface domains. At 1500 hours, a deliberate undersea posture flexed quiet dominance beneath the surface as well. A U.S. Virginia-class attack submarine rose like a shadow, breaking into light, surfacing just inside visual range of the Chinese carrier group. Near enough to be filmed, close enough to be caught on camera, distant enough to remain beyond reach, as if a ghost had chosen to show its face in daylight. It was the naval equivalent of slipping a master key into the enemy's front door, turning it slowly and leaving it ajar. For minutes, the sea gave up a secret predator that had been hunting in silence. The move showed that the invisible domain, the one warfare area every fleet depends on to stay alive, was already compromised. At 1547 hours, that fleeting exposure did more damage than a missile ever could. Imagery, eyewitness confirmation, and telemetry data spread across every circuit. An American submarine had lived in their blind spot for over a week and decided, at a moment of its choosing, to make that fact public. It was the version of discovering a sniper had been in the room for days, waiting, patient, smiling now only because he wanted you to know. Confidence in the protective screen cracked. What good were patrols, sonar nets, and layered escorts if the deadliest hunter in the ocean could come and go unnoticed? In the air, American fighters exploited the psychological break. J-15 pilots, tethered to launch cycles and dwindling fuel windows, fought uphill, their jets wheezing at the edge of endurance. Link-fed targeting data turned every separate aircraft into neurons of the same brain, reacting faster than human reflexes could recover rhythm. The pressure was pressed from the sky, from below the waves, from every angle like a tightening noose. At 1600 hours, on the surface, the lone Type 052D destroyer stayed in shadowing range but carried no real options. Every course change fed instantly into U.S. targeting geometry. 23 minutes later, the Chinese carrier strike group began withdrawal. Official explanations cited the completion of scheduled exercises, but the tactical narrative was unmistakable. The attempted intimidation campaign had failed to dislodge lawful navigation or compel a U.S. concession. Sensor-to-shooter integration, layered defensive formations, persistent electronic attack, and undersea presence combined to deter without firing a weapon. Merchant traffic continued uninterrupted. Global trade lanes remained open. The U.S. strike group demonstrated that professional integrated naval operations could impose costs on coercion while preserving stability. The encounter concluded without a shot being fired, yet its lessons were as sharp as any missile's edge. Integrated sensors provided the clarity of a map in rough waters, keeping every player in view. Layered defenses forced each probe into dead ends, like corridors closing one after another. Electronic attack shortened the opponent's reaction time until decisions stalled. Together, visible air power, silent submarines, and precise surface forces created deterrence by denial, strength shown, not spent. So, subscribe now for in-depth looks at high-stakes military strategy in